This is the moment America handed China the greatest gift in the history of global power and called it winning. Not through a war, not through a treaty, not through some secret backroom deal signed in the middle of the night. Through tariffs, through tweets, through a trade war that was supposed to bring China to its knees and instead pulled the chair out from under America's own economy while Beijing watched, smiled, and quietly signed deals with every country that Washington just pushed away. Picture the scene. It is April 2026. The White House is celebrating. The administration is calling it the most aggressive trade stance America has taken in modern history. A 145% tariff wall has been built around Chinese imports. The President of the United States is standing at the podium telling the American people that China is bleeding, that factories are coming home, that the era of being taken advantage of is officially over. And at that exact same moment, in Beijing, in Brussels, in Brasilia, in Riyadh, in Jakarta, in Pretoria, something completely different is happening. China's trade negotiators are on airplanes. China's diplomats are on phones. China's banks are offering deals that American banks no longer can. And country after country after country is quietly, politely, irreversibly turning away from Washington and toward Beijing. Not because they love China, because America just made China look like the stable, reasonable, reliable partner in a world that desperately needs one. In this breakdown, we are going to go through the numbers that the administration does not want you to see, the backroom deals already locked in, the American industries already destroyed by the war that was supposed to save them, and the single most dangerous shift in global economic power since the end of the Cold War, a shift that is not coming. It is already here. This is not a story about tariffs. This is a story about how a country tried to win a trade war and ended up losing the world. 3 years ago, the plan sounded logical, even compelling. China had been playing an unfair game for decades. Intellectual property theft running into hundreds of billions of dollars annually. State-subsidized companies flooding global markets with artificially cheap goods. American manufacturing towns hollowed out. Supply chains built inside Chinese borders that left the United States dangerously dependent on a strategic competitor. The plan was to fix all of that, to rebalance the relationship, to force China to the negotiating table by making its exports to America too expensive to compete. The original strategy, as announced, was built on 3 assumptions. First, that American consumers and businesses could absorb the cost of tariffs while China felt the pain. Second, that America's allies in Europe and Asia would stand with Washington and apply coordinated pressure on Beijing. Third, that China's economy was too dependent on American markets to survive a prolonged confrontation. He promised factory jobs returning to Ohio and Michigan within 2 years. He promised the trade deficit with China, which had reached $295 billion, would be eliminated. He promised that China would beg for a deal on America's terms. But the cost of those assumptions was never fully calculated, because the tariffs did not just hit China. They hit Canada. They hit Mexico. They hit the European Union. They hit South Korea, Japan, India, Brazil. Allies and partners who had spent decades building economic relationships with the United States. And every single one of those countries received the same message from Washington. You are either with us completely or you pay the price. The gamble was that no country would be willing to lose access to the American market. That the US economy was too large, too important, too central to global trade for anyone to walk away. He assumed that America was still irreplaceable. He assumed the world had no alternative. He assumed wrong. Because while Washington was busy building walls, Beijing was busy building bridges. And the world, quietly, then loudly, then irreversibly, started walking across them. In January 2026, the numbers started arriving, and they were not what the administration had promised. The US trade deficit with China, the one that was supposed to disappear, had not been eliminated. It had shifted. Manufacturing that left China had not come to Ohio. It had gone to Vietnam, to Malaysia, to Mexico, countries that then exported to America, creating new deficits to replace the old one. The supply chains had moved. American consumers were still paying. The factories had not come home, but that is only the first layer. Here is where it gets significantly worse. While American economists were processing the deficit numbers, something else was happening simultaneously in Southeast Asia. China had accelerated its regional comprehensive economic partnership, the largest free trade agreement in human history, covering 2.3 billion people and 30% of global GDP, and was actively using it to deepen trade ties with every country in the Asia-Pacific region that America had just pushed away with its tariff regime. The countries that used to balance between Washington and Beijing, They were no longer balancing. They were choosing. Vietnam, which had received billions in diverted manufacturing investment because of the original China tariffs, was signing deeper infrastructure agreements with Beijing. Indonesia was accelerating its rare earth mineral deals with Chinese companies. Malaysia was routing more of its trade through Chinese-backed payment systems. And at that exact same moment, the European Union, America's most important strategic and economic partner, was quietly reopening trade talks with China that had been frozen for 3 years. Pause. The European Union, 30 years of Atlantic alliance. The partner that stood with America through the Cold War, through 9/11, through the 2008 financial crisis, reopening trade negotiations with Beijing, not because Europe loves the Chinese Communist Party, because European manufacturers, German car companies, French agricultural exporters, Italian luxury goods producers had watched American tariff policy hit their exports for 2 consecutive years and made a calculation. If Washington is going to treat us like a competitor, we need to build relationships elsewhere. And while Europe was recalculating, something else was also happening at the exact same moment in the global financial system. China had been pushing for years to reduce the world's dependence on the US dollar for international trade. For years, that effort had limited success. But in 2025 and 2026, something changed. Saudi Arabia began settling a portion of its oil exports in yuan. Brazil and China expanded their bilateral trade settlement in local currencies. Russia, locked out of dollar systems by sanctions, had built a yuan-based financial architecture that other sanctioned economies were now using as a blueprint. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves, which stood at 71% in 2000, had already fallen to 58% by 2024. It is lower now. And it is still falling. Every country that America pushed away with its tariff walls was a country that took another small step toward a world where the dollar is one option among many. Not the only option, not the default. Just one choice among several. That shift multiplied across 50 countries over 18 months is not a small thing. That is the architecture of American economic power being quietly dismantled. One bilateral trade deal, one yuan settlement, one infrastructure agreement at a time. Here is what is not making the front page. Here is what is happening in the rooms the cameras do not enter. According to reports from financial analysts tracking capital flows across Southeast Asia, China's state-owned banks had pre-positioned themselves months before the tariff escalations hit their peak. The strategy, which has since been confirmed through multiple regional reporting sources, was not reactive. It was planned. While Washington was announcing new tariff levels, Beijing was already on the ground in the countries those tariffs were about to disrupt, with financing packages, infrastructure offers, and trade agreements designed to fill the space that American economic retreat was about to create. In one documented case in early 2026, a Southeast Asian government that had been in active negotiations with an American infrastructure consortium, a $4 billion port development project, received a competing offer from a Chinese state bank within 6 weeks of new American tariffs hitting its export sector. The American consortium's financing required congressional approval that was stalled by the same political gridlock producing the tariffs. The Chinese offer came with a signed term sheet and a construction start date. The contract went to China. That is not a one-time story. That is a pattern playing out across Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East simultaneously. While American companies were battling supply chain disruptions and absorbing tariff costs, Chinese companies were accelerating. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers, already producing cars at price points American automakers cannot match, had entered 12 new international markets in 2025 alone. Chinese solar panel manufacturers, hit hard by the original tariffs, had responded by building production facilities in third countries and routing exports through them. The tariff wall had been routed around, not stopped. Sources close to multiple European trade delegations have confirmed what is becoming an open secret in diplomatic circles. The phrase being used in private meetings is not alliance with America versus alignment with China. The phrase being used is strategic autonomy. Europe does not want to choose Beijing over Washington, but it is building the capacity to make that choice if Washington continues to make the relationship too costly to maintain. When the world's largest trading bloc starts using the phrase strategic autonomy, that is not a warning sign. That is a departure announcement. Why is this happening? Follow the economics. China is not winning this trade war because it is more powerful than America. It is winning because it is more patient and because the structure of the global economy gives it more ways to absorb short-term pain. Here are the numbers that explain everything. American farmers lost approximately $27 billion in export revenue in the first phase of the trade war, when China retaliated by targeting agricultural goods, soybeans, pork, corn, from the exact states that had voted most heavily for the tariff policy. The government compensated those farmers with $28 billion in direct subsidies, meaning American taxpayers paid American farmers to survive a war that was supposed to cost China, not America. China's GDP growth, despite the tariffs, came in at 4.8% in 2025. Not the collapse that was promised. Not the desperation that was supposed to bring Beijing to the table on Washington's terms. China had spent years deliberately reducing its dependence on American consumer markets, building domestic consumption, expanding into African and Asian markets, and diversifying its export base. The trade war accelerated that diversification. The pain was real. The collapse never came. Here is the power shift that has already happened. For 30 years, the United States used its position as the world's largest consumer market as leverage, the implicit promise that countries who maintained American-approved economic relationships would have access to the most valuable market on Earth. That leverage depended on there being no credible alternative. China has spent 15 years building the credible alternative. It is not yet equal to American market access, but it no longer needs to be. It only needs to be large enough that countries facing American tariff pressure have somewhere else to turn. And it is already that large. The legal and institutional consequences are also accelerating. The World Trade Organization, which America helped build and for decades used as a tool to enforce global trade rules in its favor, has now ruled against American tariff measures in multiple cases. Washington has responded by blocking WTO appellate judge appointments, effectively disabling the institution's enforcement mechanism. The result, the rules-based international trade order that America built and led for 80 years is now operating without its referee. And the countries filling that vacuum are not American allies. Here is the domino effect that is already in motion. If the dollar continues losing ground as the default currency for global trade settlement, even modestly, even slowly, the United States loses what economists call the exorbitant privilege, the ability to run large deficits, print money, and borrow cheaply because the world needs dollars to function. If that privilege erodes, American living standards face structural pressure that no tariff policy can reverse. If China locks in infrastructure and trade relationships across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America over the next 5 years, those relationships will outlast any American administration. Roads, ports, railways, and power grids built with Chinese financing create dependencies that take decades to unwind. The countries that sign those deals are not choosing communism. They are choosing whoever showed up with a check when they needed one. Foreign governments are watching this closely. Beijing is not just watching. It is acting. President Xi Jinping had a phone call with the leaders of Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia in the same week that the latest American tariff announcement dropped. The agenda of that call has not been made public. But the timing is not a coincidence. Where is the American counter-strategy? There has been talk of reshoring, bringing manufacturing back to the United States. But reshoring is a multi-decade process. Factories cannot be built in a news cycle. Workers cannot be retrained between press conferences. The supply chains that took 30 years to build in Asia cannot be rebuilt in Ohio in 4 years, regardless of what tariff levels say on paper. Here is the uncomfortable reality. The countries that America pushed away are not waiting to be welcomed back. They are building new relationships, signing new agreements, and making new calculations that put American reliability into question in ways that will outlast any specific tariff number. Meanwhile, the American middle class, the people this policy was supposed to protect, is paying more for electronics, clothing, appliances, and cars. Not because China is suffering, because tariffs are a tax, and taxes on imports are paid by the people who buy the imports, which is American consumers, which is the American middle class. The administration has not explained this publicly in those terms. It has been easier to say China is paying. China is not paying. You are. The tariff wall is not just an economic policy anymore. It is a symbol. It represents the belief that America can force the world to reorganize around its demands by making trade painful enough. It represents 80 years of post-war global economic architecture being torn apart and replaced with something that has not yet been clearly defined. And it represents the most significant unintentional gift one great power has ever handed its main competitor, the gift of positioning. China did not ask to be seen as the stable, open, reliable alternative to American economic leadership. America handed that positioning to Beijing by behaving in exactly the ways that make countries desperate for an alternative. You can dominate a trade negotiation. You cannot dominate global perception. You can impose tariffs. You cannot impose trust. You can build a wall around your market. You cannot stop the world from building roads around it. So where does it go from here? Watch the BRICS Plus summit scheduled for later in 2026. For the first time, the bloc that includes China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa, plus a growing list of new members, will formally discuss a framework for reducing dollar dependence in bilateral trade. If that framework produces even a partial agreement, the financial architecture of the global economy begins to shift in ways that are not reversible on any short timeline. Watch the EU-China trade talks. If they produce a meaningful agreement, American leverage over European economic policy, which has been the foundation of the Atlantic Alliance for 30 years, begins to crack in ways no NATO commitment can fully repair. Watch the American manufacturing numbers. If domestic factory investment does not show measurable, large-scale growth in the next 18 months, the core promise of the tariff strategy that the pain would be temporary and the gain would be permanent collapses as a political argument. And the leaders who made that promise will face a reckoning. Three things are already irreversible. 1. China's positioning as a global alternative to American economic leadership has been established. It is not theoretical anymore. It is documented in signed trade agreements, completed infrastructure projects, and realigned supply chains across 4 continents. 2. The institutions that America built to manage the global economy, the WTO, the rules-based international trading system, have been weakened from the inside by the country that built them. Rebuilding credibility inside those institutions once lost takes a generation. 3. The countries that pivoted toward Beijing during this period built relationships, habits, and dependencies that will not reverse simply because Washington changes its tone. Trust once broken is not restored by a press conference. China did not make itself stronger by outcompeting America. America made China stronger by retreating from the field and leaving space that Beijing was already prepared to fill. The most powerful country in the world does not need an enemy to weaken it. It only needs to lose patience with the slow, difficult, unglamorous work of leadership and mistake noise for strategy. That is exactly what happened. And the world is reorganizing around it in real time. Subscribe. The BRICS Summit, the EU-China talks, and the next round of American manufacturing data are all coming in the months ahead. When they land, I will break all of it down the same way I did here. Not the headline, the full picture, because the story of how America handed China the world is still being written, and the chapters ahead matter more than any tariff announcement you will see on the evening news. The clock is running. Stay locked in.